When we think about, too, the extension of, and I ask the question, how do we think about equality under the law? Or did we still get equality under the law? And this next section will focus on Japanese American school kids in California, but in other parts of the West Coast and the nation in particular. But really because as we come to World War II, when we come to the idea of how do we think about Japanese in our midst, right? Because again, that becomes a question that comes to mind. And in the 1940s, we have that mass incarceration movement of Japanese immigrants and Americans to detention centers along the west coast of the United States, right? So over 240,000 Japanese Americans are interned during this time period. There was not a single case of espionage that was ever proven, but there was that threat, that was that fear. And so many of those affected were school-age kids. So how do we think about that in terms of equality under the law? These kids, all they knew were the neighborhoods that they grew up in, right? So whether it be LA, Seattle, San Francisco. So when you're uprooting families, they grew up understanding that, yeah, you know what? We're Americans. Our school teachers and officials emphasize this idea that we are all equal under the law. But yet, what does it mean when me, my siblings, my families, my whole community members are being uprooted because we're somehow under the suspicion of being enemy aliens? So when we think about, too, right, the reality informed by perception, misperception, here's another kind of example that was very popular during World War II as we think about the public narrative and discourse about what constitutes an enemy and who. Right? So here is a very popular, and many other publications also had similar types of public service announcements, if you will. So this was taken from Life magazine. It's no longer in operation, but Life was very, very popular. Published December 22nd, 1941. And it's just a few weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, right? And this is the most ironic part of it is that this was, as that pejorative title would note, right, how to tell the Japs from the Chinese. So the upper visual has our friend, the Chinese, and how to tell them apart from the Japanese enemy at this time. And of course, if we look at the ways in which facial features are parsed out, right, so just even an example of how do you tell the difference between parchment yellow complexion versus earthy yellow complexion, right? I mean, are you really going to know the difference as you walk down the street, right? Because this is supposed to be of benefit to you, the public. Would you know that, right? You can read through those other kinds of descriptions in particular as well, because if we were to look at that now, I think we would really chuckle and laugh and just think how ridiculous this is. But this was real life. This was the way that it played out in people's lives, right? And the other caption on the bottom, where that gentleman wears that badge, not a Chinese reporter, not Japanese, please. Right? So it's a plea to say, I realize, right, that stereotype out there, we all look the same. But yet I'm different. I'm your friend, right? Because again, Chinese are our allies during World War II, Japanese, Italians, Germans. Of course, Italians and Germans are not interned at the rate that Japanese Americans were. There's another great history that looks at that. But yet it's also to provide to the general public another notion of how to tell the difference, because we realize that you really can't. And so as we think about this in the larger public discourse, my kind of question that I always ask is, how does this work out at the ground level, especially when we think about the lives of students? And when we think about, and there's so many wonderful visuals out there too, photographs that's taken during World War II about the whole Japanese-American relocation, detention, internment experience. And this is also a very popular photograph. And this is actually of Yuki Llewellyn, who attended or who worked at the University of Illinois for a number of years. So I got the chance to have a conversation with her and to really, and she still, I believe, goes around doing a lot of lectures on what this means. But this is her picture of her family and what this means to be relocated during a time. You have no idea what's happening, right? And of course, it's not until 1988 when the governmental report finally comes out that their findings are that it was really due to race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership that occurred in the ways that it did. Well, for so many residents, it's kind of too little too late, but yet there was that admission by our own government report that makes this clear of why things happened in the way that they did. And you'll note too, right, another kind of example was that the popular narrative out there was that, well, we're doing this for your own good, right? And a number of kids, especially school-age kids and high school-age kids that I would read, that I read letters of from behind barbed wire, they would raise these interesting questions like, well, if this is for our protection, how come we're the ones behind barbed wire? And how come the guards are pointing the guns at us and not outside if they're doing this for our protection, right? And one of the more poignant lines written by a high schooler during this time was that if this is a democracy, I would rather live under a dictatorship. And this becomes even more poignant when, with the research that I also conducted, this letter that I first saw, which even after all these years, right, every time I see the letter, I think about this particular student in 7th grade, right, as you can tell from that farewell message to her homeroom teacher. Ella Evanson. And there's an Ella Evanson website that you can also take a look at. I believe it's still current. But Ella Evanson was a middle school teacher and the school librarian at Washington Middle School in Seattle, Washington. And so she had her students write these farewell messages because she realized, too, as a teacher and other teachers in the schools, and I would say that this school and the principal in particular really try to impart to their students this idea that we realize there's this craziness going on in the world, but we have to remember you're still citizens and you matter, right? Unfortunately, it didn't matter at the national level, but it really still needed to be made at that local level. So the student also, in the context of all this disruption that's not only going on within her own family, the community, nationally, globally, she realizes she can't finish off the school year. And she doesn't know when and if she and her family and her friends will be back in Seattle, right? So she writes this letter to Miss Evanson, right? Because of the situation, we're asked to leave this dear city of Seattle and its surroundings. I will miss my teachers, you, Mr. Sears, the principal, and the memories that will flow back to the time when she was attending the school and the assemblies that were in the hall. But the final ways in which that not only this student, but so many others, is that she ends with, wherever I go, I'll always be a loyal American. So the student's letter, as well as the sentiments, right, is also the foundation of my first book that I would also encourage you to take a look at. Yes, this is a shameless plug of it, but hey, you know, there are these other great student letters and memories that are in there that I really encourage you to take a look at. But the thing that I want to leave you with is that the whole aspect that she raises the question, wherever she goes, she'll be a loyal American, is the fact that it's that very American identity that's being questioned, not only by her, but by others, to so many of her fellow classmates and community members.